Good morning, everybody. My name is David Amadia, president of Ridge. I'll be hosting today's tasting right off the bat. Apologies for the late start and the technical difficulties. It's not the way we like to roll. And again, I apologize, but we'll try to maybe compress the tasting a little bit, make sure we can get everybody out of here as close to 11 as possible. So welcome to the Fall 2018 virtual tasting. We're coming to you today from our Lytton Springs winery, about 4 miles north of Healdsburg in northern Sonoma County. We're sitting right in front of our Lytton Springs estate, planted in 1901. And these vines are the heart of the Lytton Springs wine, which we'll be tasting later this morning, at least West Coast time this morning. The tasting order today for the 5 wines is as follows. Hopefully you have these out in front of you by now. You might have already drank them all by now. But it's the 16 Ponzo Zin, 16 Lytton Springs, 16 Pagani Zinfandel, 16 Estate Petite Sirah from Lytton, and the 5th wine is the 15 Monte Bello. Let's see. So this is an interactive event. We really do appreciate your questions for the production team. It really adds a lot of vitality and energy to the proceedings. So feel free to send us your questions, and I'll pass those along to the winemaking team. Please email them to wholesale@ridgewine.com. That's wholesale@ridgewine.com. Or you can also use the chat function on the YouTube. Either way, the questions will get through, and if we don't answer them this morning, we will get back to you with answers for sure. We're also encouraging you to use social media this morning. Please use the hashtag RidgeVirtual. That's RidgeVirtual, one word. Photos, videos, comments, whatever, please get them up there, and we'll make sure those get circulated as well. So just quick introductions. Joining us today are key members of our production team, and I really like to thank them for taking time. We're right in the middle of harvest to come and spend some time with me and you today. So starting first on my left is Eric Baugher. Eric is our COO and Monte Bello winemaker, and he joined Ridge in 1994, and he's in his 24th year here at Ridge. So Eric, thanks for joining. In the middle there is David Gates. David is our Senior VP of Vineyard Operations, in charge of all of our vineyards, estate, and otherwise. Joined Ridge in 1989 and is in his 29th year at Ridge. 29th or 30th harvest?
30th vintage.
30th vintage.
If I make it.
We're only about a third of the way. Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on you, David. And then on the far left is John Olney, our COO and Lytton Springs winemaker. Joined Ridge in 1996 and is in his 22nd year here at Ridge. So a lot of experience with us this morning. A few notes to start off real quickly. Obviously, our audience is diminished because of Florence, and a lot of people who had planned to join us in the Southeast, in the Carolinas, Georgia, Maryland, obviously have more pressing issues today. So we're missing them, but wishing them the best, and hopefully everybody is high and dry today. Next, we wanted to welcome a new distributor to the family who's joining us today. Our distributor in Oregon, who had been in business for over 40 years, abruptly decided to shut their doors about 5 weeks ago with little notice to us. So we quickly went out and interviewed 8 prospective replacements, and one of those distributors really shined through, and that's Galaxy, who's joining us this morning. And welcome to the Ridge family. We found a photo of Bob and Matt we wanted to share. We're going to throw that up on the screen for you guys to take a look at. I'm not sure if it inspires a ton of confidence, but we feel like as a sign you've made it. You know, if you have your own bobblehead, that's certainly a sign you've made it to the top. So I'm very jealous. I want my bobblehead too. So before we started to taste the 5 wines, obviously we're right in the middle of the harvest here in 2018, and wanted to ask David Gates and also the winemakers to weigh in. And what you're seeing so far, we're about 30% into the harvest, David. So
Yeah.
what are we seeing?
Well, this year is interesting, as all years are interesting, but It seems like the vines in northern Sonoma County or northern California have actually recovered nicely from the drought. So yields are healthy, typically above estimates, and that combined with a little bit of cool weather of the end of last month slowed down the start of harvest. So we kind of went from 0 to 60 in the last 2 weeks. From waiting and waiting to now, everything is ready to go. Flavors, I think, are really good. The other interesting thing that we'll look back and think of in 2016 is that the really warm areas that we think of, like Lodi or the foothills, weren't that warm this year. The temperatures overall from the Bay Area north were pretty constant and not really that warm.
Yeah, we didn't really have any days over 100, right?
Not very few here. South of the Bay Area, it's a different story. Yeah. But yeah, Northern California it was a beautiful summer, and the vines grew nicely, mainly because of those late spring rains that we had. Yeah. South of the Bay Area, it's a little more typical. Paso Robles, we just finished the last of Benito Ducey's Zin yesterday. Yields were up a little bit, which is good, but they had 20 out of 30 days in July were over 100, sometimes over 105. So that's much more typical.
That's normal.
Yeah. More
it
normal.
Up the flavors in those grapes.
Yeah.
It really did.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Really flavorful. Yeah.
But on average, running, about 2 weeks behind normal this year? Is that fair to say?
I'd say about a week behind normal.
Okay.
But what's normal? I mean, we've had some really
Some
early years.
Early years and some really late years.
Yeah.
It's a moving target, normal. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, and it's nice now. I mean, it's a beautiful day here in Dry Creek. I think the highs will be in the low 80s. So it seems like it's a nice, gentle harvest. There's not this rush, is there, that maybe we've seen in some hotter years?
Yes, that's very true. So that as the funny thing is, though, like over the last weekend, we had very cool week or two, about 10 days, where Zinfandel sugars hadn't quite made it to 22, and that's kind of the tipping point for Zin. Yeah. So they sat there, and then we had two warm days, and they weren't even that warm, and then they kind of made up for those 10 days that they weren't doing anything, and that's when we went from 0 to 60 and really started getting into harvest. But flavors are great, I think. You guys could.
Flavors are good.
It's high quality. I mean,
acids are pretty nice too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, good acid,
balanced.
good color, nice ripe tannins. Yeah, the extractions have been really good.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
And
it's
volume
great.
too. I mean,
And on volume on top of that, which we've all been waiting for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
And David, about Monte Bello, anything particular you want to say about what you're seeing so far there?
So Chardonnay again has a better than normal crop, a little bit better than normal. So it's and it's not untypical that it's delayed about the same as our Zin. So we've just kind of dipped our toes into
we're kind of maybe
Chardonnay.
halfway through.
No, not
well,
even.
about 40%.
Yeah, 40%.
Yeah, the most stressed sections of the vineyard.
And the Cabernet and Merlot on Monte Bello, I thought were going to be kind of 2 weeks behind, but they're not. They're catching up rapidly. So it's going to be slam bang, get it all done.
Yeah, we're going to go finish Zin and start right into Cabernet.
It's right into Cab and the Bordeaux varieties. Okay. Excellent. Well, good. Well, that's a great overview of 18. We're looking forward to that. And we're about, 30% in right now, you'd say, David?
Yeah, maybe a little more. John's a little further than that. Eric's a little less than that.
Yeah.
So
all right. Still got a ways to go.
Oh, yeah.
Some more long days?
No, more coming by the end of this weekend.
It's going to be a busy weekend.
Oh, it's starting to.
Yeah, we're getting our first Geiseville grapes today.
I have to tell you that walking around the winery, there's an excitement in the air.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what people in this business live for.
Yeah, this is the moment that counts.
Yeah.
Happy yeasts and happy people.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, so why don't we get to our first wine, which is the 16 Ponzo. And David, why don't I ask you to kick us off on that wine as well?
Sure. This is Russian River, just south of the town of Healdsburg, maybe 5 miles from the winery here. It's just in a cool enough spot that, in fact, we're going to pick the old vines here, planted in the 50s tomorrow. Just like we're going to pick the vines right behind us tomorrow. Okay. It's typically a little bit later, a little brighter acidity. So that's kind of what makes Ponzo, in my mind, special. It's also very different soil. It's right off the river, so it's a lot of sand and loam. Yeah. and it's been owned by the Ponzo family. Bob Ponzo is the current caretaker of these vines and doing a great job. It's mostly Zin. There's a little bit of Petite Sirah that were planted in the old block section. The first 8 or so rows are mixed Petite Sirah, Pelersan, Syrah.
So John, we're tasting 3 Zins in a row here, starting with the Ponzo. What are the flavors for you that really are distinctive for Ponzo versus the Lytton or the Pagani?
Well, I think like David said, with the Ponzo, you have that bright acidity that gives sort of shifts the fruit more towards the red spectrum. It's also a fairly soft wine, being mostly Zinfandel, doesn't have the amount of Petite Sirah that the Lytton Springs has, and of course Lytton Springs being more the clay soil, there's more structure there, and then the fruit's sort of a little more blackberry. And then Pagani, I think, is maybe a little more in line sort of with Ponzo, being, 2 of our cooler climate Zinfandels. But I think you get a little more concentration and even lower acidity in the Pagani, so it changes the flavor profile a little bit.
It does, yeah. Yeah, for me, the Ponzo, it's a little lighter body than the other Zins too, and the higher acidity actually for me accentuates the tannins too. So it feels like there's maybe more structure than there is there in the wine because of that really bright, fresh acidity in the wine. It's really always been one of my favorites. Beautiful wine. So John, can I ask you to jump on and talk about the 16 Lytton? We'll move along
Sure.
here.
Yeah, so 16 was, was a vintage where it was sort of sandwiched in between 15 and 17, both of which were much lower yielding than 16. 16 was, it wasn't a high yield vintage, but I think it really made wines that, especially the fruit expression is a little more elegant, very aromatic. Wine for Lytton Springs, but then on the palate you still have that the sort of structure, that tannic backbone that's always been part of the wine. Again, a lot of that coming from, I think it's a little over 20% Petite this year, and really makes it an age-worthy Zinfandel for 8, 10, 12 years in the cellar.
So, Zin is notoriously high in sugar, higher in alcohol wine, and we know you're working with a mixed black vineyard. How do you deal with that? How do you find out when to pick? When do you get that ultimate sort of point that you want to pick the grapes at in a vineyard like one behind us here?
Yeah, so it's a good point. This is really Lytton Springs, also Geyserville. 2 classic examples of field blend where you have a majority of Zinfandel, and then a number of secondary varietals like Petite Sirah, like Carignan, and they're planted randomly. So when we're going out, we're sampling randomly too, and so I think we get a pretty good picture of the vineyard as a whole, and and then when we do go and pick. We're picking the vineyard blocks together, so we're co-fermenting those different varietals. And I think what's so special about these old vineyards is just the specific varietals that were chosen. So you have Carignan, which gets physiologically ripe at a lower sugar, and sugar is much higher in the Zinfandel, and having that those varietals sort of balances each other out.
Yeah. David, is there a target Brix that we're going for our Zinfandels, and does it vary from vineyard to vineyard, or does it vary?
Vintage to vintage, yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of heat you get during the days leading up to harvest can really turn things around.
How do you do that calculation in terms of what Brix you're targeting?
Well, it depends on what Brix you're measuring. So
Yeah, I know, because it's the vineyard sample versus what's actually in the fermenter could be like 2-3 Brix off.
But you're making your decisions based on your sampling, though, right?
Taste,
Yeah.
taste.
Is more
and
taste than Brix?
tasting. Yeah.
Okay, so so it seems like you look at Brix, but it's more about the flavors you're tasting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
Be
it's also-
physiologically right.
It's also about going into the vineyard
Yeah,
to
you
really
gotta
look
really look
at
the vines.
the the vines, especially Zinfandel, because Zinfandel has fairly thin skin, and it's one of the reasons it has such high sugar is it tends to shrivel very quickly, and that concentrates the sugar. So understanding, what percentage of shrivel you have there, I think really informs the picking decision, because if you have a lot of shrivel out there and it's 23.5, then by the time it gets picked, it'll soak out and it'll be 25. So you have to sort of be ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And 22 bricks, 22% soluble solids. That's kind of I call it the tipping point for Zin. So you get below that, and it doesn't taste ripe, and it's not going to soak out.
Right.
Above that, it can move very quickly. So instead of sampling once a week, as you get towards close to 22, you're out there much more often.
Several times a week.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And John has a really nice trick that Eric really can't do up here, in that we can send a crew out and just pick one little section of go 2 rows down a block, and then crush it and see what, if you're not quite sure, crush it, see what happens. And
if it looks good, then go in.
Exactly.
And
You're
get the
basically
rest.
taking a bigger sample at that point.
Yes, exactly. A bigger sample,
Right.
It works really well. Eric can't do that because of the grapes that are picked up here have to go all the way down to Monte Bello. So
And we try to fill up the truck.
we try to.
Yeah.
It gets,
And is there an ultimate alcohol level you're looking for in a Zinfandel or Zinfandel blend?
The ideal is the low 14%. I
Right.
mean, you kind of have to be just above 14 to get that physiological ripeness.
Right.
Unless you have just pure 100-plus-year-old Zen vines that are field blended and, low yields. You can occasionally, like at Mazzoni, where we have that, you can come in the mid-13s and make a beautiful,
With the old
rich, intense wine. Yeah.
And that's just because the older vines, you get fuller ripeness at lower alcohols.
Yeah,
Yeah.
deeper roots, more access to water, lower yield, so that yield to canopy balance.
Yeah.
You can get flavor at a lower sugar level.
Yeah, I think if I sort of view it as when you hit 15% alcohol and you get above that, then at that point the yeast, they really can't ferment much more of the sugar, and then you start having wines that have some residual sugar in it, and with the real high alcohol, you lose the balance, and
and also you lose your acid too. Once you get to 15%,
exactly.
which is Zinfandel, it just
Yeah.
all that acid just drops out.
And then when you're dealing with, 6 Zinfandels in a portfolio at 15%, for me, they all start to taste the same.
Well,
You lose-
I mean, you start to
Yeah.
lose your vineyard character.
Vineyard
It gets
character.
drowned out in that
Yeah.
ripeness.
Yeah, for sure. And so what I'm understanding is it's a real struggle out there because you need to get over that 22 point, but after that point, they can go
And
very
then you
quickly,
gotta be
soak
prepared
out.
to move very fast and
Yeah.
assemble picking teams and have the trucking and gondolas, everything.
So that's why you
ready
guys
to
are all
go.
looking so stressed out today. Is that
Well,
what
it's
I'm hearing?
like getting our picking orders in, and
All
But,
right.
I mean, the great thing about 18 is that we've had this nice,
Yeah.
cooler weather, so it's just allowed us to kind of cruise into harvest and
Okay.
not be under the pressure. I mean, I just was walking through Geyserville, and it just looks gorgeous. We don't really have a whole lot of shrivel to worry about, and
So you're a little less stressed than normal.
yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so the third wine, Pagani Ranch Zinfandel. David, want to lead us off on that wine?
Yes, this is right off Highway 12 in Sonoma Valley, up between Glen Ellen and Kenwood. And it's very picturesque vineyard, probably one of the Alicante block that's right off the highway until Dino Amentiti and the Pagani family planted some young Zin and Petite Sirah vines in front of it. People would line up there and taking pictures of those Alicante vines because they'd flame out at this time of year, get this brilliant red color, And that's one of the neat parts or things about Pagani is the Alicante that's in it. It's probably a higher percentage of Alicante in this wine than any of our other wines.
I can't think of any other vineyard that has that much Alicante. It's
Yeah.
a really special grape.
And it's a neat site, 2 different soil types, 2 different ages of vines, some of them very old, planted in the 1800s, and some planted right in the middle of Prohibition in 1922. And then now, starting in, I think 2013 was the first year, some younger vines that we get a small percentage that go into this which is really exciting for me, because that means that the Pagani family et al. has made a big investment in their ranch and want to try to keep it in the family by planting some younger blocks with our specifics. So it's like 15 to 70% Petite Sirah, and the rest some nice heritage selections of Zinfandel, and so far they've been really good. It's a lot more work for young vines, but the yields are a little bit better, so it pays off.
The more work in terms of dropping more fruit.
Yeah, it's like I always say that it's if you have a really good old vine vineyard in a good spot, all you have to do is you don't prune it and pick it, but almost. That's there's not a lot to do except sometimes want a little bit more crop, and occasionally once every 5 years. Thin a little bit. Young vines, it's young Zin, young Carignan, young Petite Sirah, they're very, very prolific. So you're out there trying to decide when to thin, how much to thin.
A lot of foliage too, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, I was just talking with Dino Amentiti, who's farming the Pagani Ranch, and he's going into the young vines for the third time this year just for dropping fruit.
Yeah. Wow.
And he'll go in a fourth time in a couple sections. That's just the name of the game.
So it was mentioned earlier that Pagani, like Ponzo, is a cooler site for Zinfandel, and Pagani is probably the coolest site we work with for Zin.
Except for Jim Zimmer Ranch,
Okay.
Monte Bello.
Yeah, let's not confuse people.
The extreme of cool climate.
Right.
Yeah.
But so
For Sonoma, though,
what does that mean, that extended hang time in this wine? I mean, obviously it has probably the longest hang time Vinny Zin we work with outside of Jim Zamir.
Yeah. Well, for me, I always kind of say it's Zin on the wild side, so it has different aromatics, and part of that is the Alicante, but part of it is just Zinfandel in a cool site does a little bit more. So there's maybe a little more flowery. It's less dusty blackberry that you get in Dry Creek.
Yeah.
It's a little bit less of the mineral that you can get and maybe some mint that you can find out of Geyserville. So it's unique.
It's a very unique wine.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people try this wine and they think it comes from a warm region because it does lose some acid, like you were talking about, John. It doesn't feel always like a cool climate wine, but it has those bright sort of tropical fruit flavors in it that are cool climate. So it's a really interesting wine. It's very unique. Yeah, absolutely. Now, native yeast fermentation, John, I mean, that's obviously what we practice. What are the challenges with that? What happens when you get a stuck fermentation, when you're reliant on native yeast?
Well, I think I don't really. There's a lot of discussion about the relationship between native yeast and stuck fermentations, but I don't think we really experience that hardly at all. I think that there's no doubt that when you're using native yeast, you're starting with a much smaller population of yeast, so the fermentation will start slower, but it's not a bad thing, and it will. The entire fermentation will take longer to do, but as long as it's constant and it keeps moving, it really it works really well for us.
Yeah, all my years of doing it, and probably 2,000-3,000 fermentation events.
Yeah,
I've had maybe 6 ever stick on me.
Right.
Give me grief, but eventually they all ferment to dryness. So
that slow start would maybe freak some winemakers out, though. Is that probably true?
I think there's. I think there's
for like the quick turnover of that tank. To empty it, you add a bunch of commercial yeast, and you'll have it done in like 4 or 5 days.
Sure.
But I think there's a little fear of the unknown and the sense of not, knowing exactly what yeast is, because when you use commercial yeast, I mean, the yeast are essentially engineered to just dominate. So you have one single strain of yeast that just takes over and does the whole thing and just really bowls over the whole fermentation.
Flavor.
Well, that's part of the thinking, though, isn't it? It's like, well, I'm going to choose this yeast because I want these flavors.
No, it's part of the marketing.
Really? The yeast catalog.
Is it marketing by the yeast company?
Oh, you bet. It's big business. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
You can derive certain flavors out of that particular selection.
And is that real or imagined?
Both.
Yeah. Well,
they actually do have a couple strains that won't throw SO2. So for whatever reason, but go figure. I think it's more hype than anything.
Yeah.
Okay. It's an interesting discussion.
The natural yeast are free, and it's you know, reliable, and you know, it's rare that I ever get reduction and all the issues that you hear, you know, the reasons for doing commercial inoculums.
Well, I think after 60 years, we're pretty confident with the results.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it's worked really well.
The experiments seem to have been successful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we've done this side by side, so you know,
Yeah.
and then tasting blind, you can see the impact of what the commercial yeast can do to your wine.
Yeah.
It leads to a more simple wine that's going to be very squeaky clean and not really offer much complexity.
Not as much
Versus the
interest.
natural, yeah, the natural is going to be more expressive of the place, the variety. It's going to be you know, in the end, a more layered, interesting wine.
A true terroir wine.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So why don't we move to wine number 4, and John, why don't you take us through? It's the 16 Lytton Estate Petite Sirah.
Sure. So, yeah, this is a 100% Petite Sirah from our Lytton West vineyard. And you know, Petite Sirah is something that Ridge has been producing for decades. However, we always produced it from the York Creek vineyard over in Napa on Spring Mountain. But in the early 90s, we you know, tried making a Petite Sirah here at Lytton Springs on just sort of a trial, smaller lot basis, and we were really so impressed with it that in '99 we made our first national Petite, and I actually really enjoy making the wine because it sort of presents a challenge in the sense that Petite Sirah is a grape with enormous amounts of color and tannin, and it's very easy if you just sort of let it go and let it macerate too long to get a wine that is just so tannic that it's really out of balance in the end. And so really trying to find that sort of balance point where you have enough tannin and color, the right acidity is it's a fun part of the job.
Good job.
And we just, after tasting 4 wines from the 16 vintage, we probably should say a little bit about that vintage for Zin and Petite Sirah and what that vintage was like relative to the conditions going into that season. David, you want to say a couple words?
I forgot.
You forgot? You're so focused on 18.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know.
No, 16 from what I remember, we actually got some rain, so the drought was broken that year.
That's right.
And the vines didn't all fully recover. They grew very beautifully, but they were still, the bud fruitfulness is not a function just of the current year, but it's a function of the year prior. And the vines really hit the wall in 15, so they weren't that fruitful in 2016. So even though the vines grew beautifully, it was basically setting them up for 17, which we had some bad weather at Bloom, but basically setting everying up for this year.
18.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the rebound.
Yeah, but 16 was a softer year, so it was a little more easier growing conditions. The vines grew, like I say, beautifully. They ripened quickly, and yeah, that's about all I
Kind of a nice
remember.
warm summer. I mean,
Yeah.
not too much fog.
Well, I remember the drought being broken. There was a lot of people were feeling good about that, and they were feeling, I think, those that without the experience were feeling, well, we're going to have a big year because the drought was broken, and then there was, it didn't really come to fruition that year in 16. So it was a bit of a smaller crop, but concentrated flavors, terroir expression here. Certainly a solid vintage quality-wise. We're seeing great wines.
But very generous wines too. They're like you were saying, very aromatic and yeah.
Well structured. I mean, for aging too. I mean, they're really pretty intense.
And you can really see trying the Petite Sirah, even what 10% or 15% of that variety will do in a Zinfandel blend in terms of really making up for that lack of color and tannin that the Zinfandel grape maybe suffers from. It's just you can see how it could be the perfect complement.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing it does, it does all that without sort of masking the fruit of the Zinfandel, right?
Yeah,
It still allows.
synergy, flavor of Petite Sirah with Zinfandel. They work well together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good. So Eric, we're finally coming to you.
Monte Bello.
2015 Monte Bello.
So here we are coming to the 15 vintage, which was the year where we got hit by late spring rain. So the yields were really taken down on virtually every vineyard. Monte Bello didn't escape that, and so of the Bordeaux grapes that year, we were below average yield by easily 30%. So we took a pretty good yield hit, but then had this nice summertime for it all to ripen. So with those low yields, we cruised to harvest and harvested most of the fruit early, and I think we were done by the 8th of October that year. So most of this fruit came off in September and fermented really well. I mean, it was just a year where the tannins were just very elegant and really surrounded by beautiful fruit. And then we fermented everything separate, all the different plots that we have on the mountain, barreled down everything into new cooperage, let the malolactics finish, and then we pulled out barrel samples of all the different lots that really look like classic Monte Bello, and then did our blind tasting to assemble. And then through that assemblage process, we just found that there was so much wonderful quality across the whole entire vineyard, all these different lots, that we were able to make at least size. A decent amount of Monte Bello that year. But then not much. Well, we didn't make a Merlot. I mean, Merlot just really took a huge hit on yield. So there was just no extra Merlot to do a separate bottling. And then the estate cab was tiny.
Yeah, everybody knows.
Yeah. But it's tiny, but really amazing wine. But here is the Monte Bello. I mean, it's a really powerful wine.
It's super powerful.
It's got all 4 varieties in it, so Cab, Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Franc. And let's see what's unique about it. Well, it's actually a typical amount of Cabernet Sauvignon, so 77%, 11 Merlot, which is a little bit on the lighter side, but then a healthy amount of Petit Verdot and Franc. So the Petit Verdot is our equivalent of Petite Sirah for Zin. Petit Verdot is that magical blending grape for color and violet notes and some really rich dark berry character.
Beautiful wine. Obviously, some of the reviewers that we really respect have really loved this wine. William Kelly, Galani have really loved this wine as well. It sort of comes in a string, Eric, of these drought harvests, right? Sort of 13, 14, 15. How does this compare to some of those other years, which were marvelous, concentrated, powerful wines too?
Yeah, I know. We've been so fortunate to just have the conditions to really make some powerful vintages of these recent years. The 15 is going to age just as gracefully as any of these really powerful vintages like 12 and 13.
Yeah.
It's got the weight, the richness, the tannin structure. I see it going out, I mean, easily 50 years. And then we've got the 16, which we just bottled, 17, which is that really wet year, but yet we were also able to make a really concentrated Monte Bello. I think it's just really with David Gates' real, good control over viticulture there, managing yields, and then working through Mother Nature on, the conditions of that season to really raise a crop of grapes that have all the essential elements to make a really powerful Monte Bello. Yeah. And then carefully fermenting it and then doing the selection process. So by blind taste, arriving at Monte Bellos that are of this weight and intensity.
Okay.
Yeah, Monte Bello always has really good acidity.
Yeah.
But for me, I also see in the 15 what we saw in the Zinfandels from 15 is even just a little bit extra acidity.
Yeah.
And that I think is from the drought year and the early harvest on everything. It retained more acidity.
Just because we had to get out there and pick it so early.
Yeah, I think so.
It just didn't give it opportunity.
We always have high acid, so I mean, it's always going to be deacidification occurring most years, just to help kind of take it down a little bit.
So let's say you're a somm in a restaurant, Eric, okay? And you have a guest who wants to buy a Cabernet to go with his meal, and he's someone who normally buys Camus or Silver Oak or this style of bigger Napa wine. What would you do to convince him that he should try Monte Bello?
Well, hopefully have an older vintage.
Sure, let's assume okay, for the sake of argument, let's have an older vintage on the menu.
Yeah, I mean, just say, it's one of America's great Cabernets. It's worth trying. It's, especially with the aging potential of this vineyard, it's legendary. It's known for being capable of aging, and it's going to be as great as any of the first growth of Bordeaux.
Yeah.
It's not going to be sweet, but with bottle age, it will arrive at a point where it is perceptibly sweet because the tannins soften a bit. Yeah. It's really round. The fruit becomes really appealing.
So do you feel like a need to maybe warn them it's going to taste a little bit different than the wines they're used to drinking?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, because it is nothing like Silver Oak or Caymus.
Right.
I mean, we don't pick at very high bricks. So we don't have residual sugar left in the wine. But yet our use of American oak does
add some sweetness.
Add that sweetness
in
an exotic way. And we're using really fine American oak barrels that we've really been able to source and work with closely to make sure that they, the barrels we're using are not like the same ones that Silver Oak will use. So we're not going for that dill character. Right. We're going for oak that integrates nicely, gives us that positive sweetness.
And how are the barrels treated, aged, produced differently to avoid those flavors?
Well,
those dill
it's all
flavors?
about really sourcing, a tree, going into a forest and really looking for trees that have grown with a lot of stress, so that the growth rings are really narrow and tight grain, and then milling the wood into the staves and just letting it sit out in the forest for 2 years minimum.
Yeah.
And then rotating the wood. So every, at least 6 months, turning the wood so that it will uniformly season, and then bringing the wood in after 2 years, making the staves, assembling the barrels, and toasting.
Right. So that time out in nature, out in the forest, that's
leaching really out. It's drawing out a lot of that herbaceousness that's typical of white oak.
Right.
And then you've got these mycelia and fungi and things that are growing in the wood out in that forest, and it's breaking down the cellulose and releasing the sweetness, so that the wood is sweet once it's coming into the state or into the cooperage.
Yeah.
For barrel making.
And we always do this experiment every year where we have 6 or so French oak barrels, and you can taste it side by side with the American, and it is so apparent and so clear that the oak has such a dramatic impact on the wine.
It does.
Yeah.
And within all the different American oaks that we use from different forests, you see the forest effect.
Yeah.
You can taste a barrel made from the Virginia oak versus Missouri, and it's the same species of tree, but growing in such a different environment, it's going to really give you a different impact of flavor.
Okay.
And here we have, in Monte Bello, typically anywhere between 20 and 30 different oaks that are part of my big spice rack.
It's your spice rack.
Yeah.
I know.
And the French is in there. It's in here in just the tiniest way. And, that's always been our kind of control of checking our American oak barrels against the French and just seeing, what's the level of quality in our American coopered barrels. And we're pretty happy with the cooperages that we're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always struck by how much more tannin you get in the French oak barrel, that it adds to the wine,
you get
and less
great aromatics with French oak, but you get then a lot of tannin.
But to me, it really starts to taste like an imitation of Bordeaux at that point. It doesn't taste like Monte Bello. It just doesn't anymore.
Yeah.
So anyway, I promise to try to keep this as close to 11 as possible. So I want to thank the panel, John, David, Eric. Thank you for your time during a very busy time of year to join us today. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for your patience this morning. Again, apologizing for the technical difficulties. We promise we'll fix this for spring next year. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend. Good luck with the fall releases, and we'll be seeing you all soon. Thank you very much.